Hello, my dearest insomniacs, my connoisseurs of catastrophe, my late-night lurkers in the shadowy corners of the internet. Welcome back to The Dark History, the only channel on the web dedicated to tucking you into bed with tales so grim, so utterly disastrous, that your own problems will feel like a gentle lullaby. We are your audio sleeping aid for the historically morbid, your chamomile tea brewed with a splash of calamity. Tonight, we're peeling back the gilded cover of one of history's most ambitious and spectacularly bungled startup ventures. Imagine, if you will, booking the all-inclusive, 5-star resort of a lifetime. The brochures are glossy, promising golden beaches, untold riches, and a chance to get in on the ground floor of a brand new world. You pack your finest linens, your fanciest hat, and absolutely zero practical skills, only to arrive and discover that the resort is a mosquito-infested swamp. The welcome buffet consists of whatever you can wrestle out of the mud, and the previous guests have left some truly horrifying reviews, etched into bones. Yes, tonight we are delving into a story of ambition so grand and preparation so poor that it led to the ultimate dietary taboo. We are talking about the Jamestown starving time. A period so bleak, it makes your worst camping trip look like a weekend at the Four Seasons. It's a tale of desperation, of disastrous management, and of what happens when a group of people, promised a paradise, find themselves in a hell of their own making, forced to eat the unthinkable. So, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for a journey into the heart of a hungry darkness. And as always, if you enjoy having your sleep schedule utterly ruined by historical horror, do consider feeding the algorithm. Give that like button a gentle tap, subscribe for more tales of woe, and comment below to let us know what fresh hell you'd like us to explore next. Now, let's set sail for a land of opportunity, a land of hope, a land that would very soon run out of everything except misery. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a prospectus, a business plan drafted in a plush, wood-paneled offices of London. A group of very wealthy, very optimistic gentlemen, who collectively formed the Virginia Company, had an idea. It was a brilliant idea, if you were one of them. The plan was simple: pool their money, get a royal charter from the king, and send a bunch of other, less wealthy people across the Atlantic to a place they called Virginia. What would these people do there? Well, the specifics were a bit fuzzy, but the general gist was get rich, quick. They were expecting to find gold lying on the ground like cobblestones. They were expecting to find a passage to the Pacific Ocean just around the next river bend. They were expecting to find a native population just thrilled to trade priceless resources for a few shiny beads and a tin pot. What they were not expecting was reality. And reality, as we shall see, has a notoriously savage bite. The first wave of colonists was, let's be generous and call them a diverse group. On one hand, you had your laborers, your carpenters, your blacksmiths, the kind of people you'd actually want with you if you were building a civilization from scratch. On the other hand, and making up a bafflingly large percentage of the manifest, were the gentlemen. Now, a gentleman in this era was a man whose primary skill was owning land and not working on it. Their hands were softer than a freshly powdered wig. Their daily exertion involved choosing which doublet to wear. The idea of digging a well, planting a crop, or felling a tree was as alien to them as the concept of a stable internet connection. They were investors, adventurers, the younger sons of nobles with no inheritance and a whole lot of pride. They were coming to Virginia not to toil, but to rule. They imagined themselves as conquistadors and roughs, overseeing vast estates worked by someone else. This fundamental misunderstanding of the job description was the first crack in the foundation of Jamestown, a crack that would soon widen into a chasm of despair. So, they boarded the ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery. 3 vessels packed to the gunwales with hope, hubris, and about 104 men and boys who were about to have a very, very bad time. The journey itself was a preview of the delights to come. Months at sea, crammed into a space smaller than a modern studio apartment, with the constant companionship of rats, weevils, and the ever-present stench of unwashed humanity. The diet consisted of hardtack biscuits, so dense they could be used as weaponry, salted meat that was more salt than meat, and stale, slimy water. Scurvy, a delightful condition caused by a lack of vitamin C, began to make its presence felt, with gums bleeding, teeth loosening, and old wounds reopening as if in memory of past traumas. It was a floating petri dish of misery, a crucible that should have forged a band of hardened brothers, but instead, it mostly just fostered resentment and boils. The gentlemen, naturally, felt they were above the squalor, while the commoners did the actual sailing and swabbing. The class divide that was a fact of life in England became a source of simmering tension on the high seas. Already, before they even seen a single tree of the New World, the project was curdling. They were a dysfunctional family on the world's worst road trip, heading toward a destination they knew nothing about, armed with a map drawn from equal parts wishful thinking and pure fantasy. They were not pioneers, they were lottery ticket holders, sailing toward a jackpot that didn't exist, utterly oblivious to the price they, and others, were about to pay for their gilded dreams. The salt spray on their faces felt like a promise, but it was really just the ocean seasoning them for the feast of horrors that awaited. Upon their eventual arrival in the Chesapeake Bay, after a journey that felt longer than several geological ages, the first emotion was one of profound relief, swiftly followed by profound disappointment. The investors back in London had sold them a vision of a gentle, welcoming paradise. What they found was a sprawling, humid, and deeply confusing landscape. The air, thick enough to chew, was buzzing with insects the size of small birds, each one seemingly on a personal mission to sample English blood. The forests were dense, dark, and menacing, not the manicured woodlands of home, but a primeval tangle of vegetation that seemed to watch them with a silent, ancient indifference. This was not a garden waiting to be plucked, it was a wilderness that had to be conquered, and they had brought poets and fops to do a lumberjack's job. Their first order of business was to choose a location for their settlement. Following the Virginia Company's instructions to the letter, instructions written by men 3,000 miles away who thought a map was just a pretty picture, they sailed up a river they named the James, in honor of their king. They ignored several promising spots with fresh water and good drainage, spots that local native tribes had wisely built their own villages near. Instead, they selected a low-lying, swampy peninsula. Why? Because it was unoccupied, which they took as a good sign rather than the colossal red flag it was. It was unoccupied for a very good reason. It was a death trap. The land was marshy, the water brackish and tidal, and it was the ancestral breeding ground for every mosquito and waterborne pathogen on the continent. It offered a decent defensive position against potential Spanish attacks from the sea, a fear that was constantly on their minds, but it was a catastrophic choice for long-term survival. It was like choosing to build your dream home in the middle of a toxic waste dump because the property taxes were low. They named their glorious new home Jamestown. And so, with an almost heroic level of misplaced confidence, they began to build their future. The gentleman, of course, directed the proceedings from shady spots, occasionally offering unhelpful advice while the commoners sweated and swore and swung the axes. They built a crude triangular fort, a bulwark against the dangers they imagined, Spanish warships and perhaps dragons, while completely ignoring the more immediate threats of starvation and disease festering right under their feet. The river that was their main source of water was a brackish stew. In the summer, it was low and stagnant, a warm soup of salt, human waste, and whatever else had decided to die in it that day. Drinking it led to salt poisoning, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The very water they needed to live was actively trying to kill them. It was a slow, debilitating siege, not by an enemy army, but by their own environment. Their first summer was a symphony of suffering. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that drained the will to move. The humidity was a wet blanket they could never throw off. And the diseases began to claim them, one by one. Men would be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. The official records, written with a grim stoicism, list the dead with terrifying frequency. The fort, intended to be a beacon of English civilization, was rapidly becoming a hospital and a morgue. Food, or the lack thereof, quickly became the central obsession. The supplies they had brought from England were dwindling at an alarming rate, partly because they were being consumed and partly because they were rotting in the humid air. The wheat they had brought to plant was sown at the wrong time of year, and it withered in the Virginia sun. They were supposed to be prospectors, not farmers. They spent their days searching for gold, digging up shiny rocks and fool's gold, which they excitedly packed into barrels to send back to their investors. They were literally shipping dirt back to London while standing on fertile ground they refused to cultivate. The local Powhatan Confederacy, a sophisticated network of Algonquian-speaking tribes led by the powerful chief Wahunsinkaw, whom the English called simply Powhatan, watched these strange, pale newcomers with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and probably a great deal of amusement. Here were men who wore absurdly heavy clothing in the sweltering heat, who had no idea how to hunt or fish or grow corn, and who seemed to be dying in droves from their own incompetence. The Powhatan were masters of their environment. They had vast fields of corn, beans, and squash. They knew the rhythms of the seasons, the secrets of the forest, and the best places to find fish and game. They could have been the colonists' salvation. But the relationship was fraught from the very beginning. The English saw the natives as savages to be either dominated or converted. They wanted food, but they approached the situation with the arrogance of conquerors, not the humility of guests. There were moments of trade, tense and transactional. The English offered copper and beads, which the Powhatan valued, in exchange for life-saving corn. But these moments were punctuated by English aggression and theft, which understandably bred distrust and hostility. The colonists were trapped in a paradox of their own making. They were desperately dependent on the very people they simultaneously looked down upon and antagonized. They were like starving houseguests who kept insulting the chef. This toxic dynamic would have dire consequences. As that first brutal summer bled into a grim autumn, the body count rose. The original 100-and-something colonists were reduced by half. The fort was filled with the groans of the dying and the quiet despair of the survivors. The dream of gold and glory had evaporated in the humid air, replaced by the gnawing reality of an empty stomach and the ever-present buzz of the mosquito. The New World wasn't giving up its secrets or its riches easily. It was demanding a tribute, and it was being paid in English lives. The first chapter of Jamestown's history was written in sweat, sickness, and the shallow graves dug in the swampy soil. The worst, however, was yet to come. Into this unfolding disaster strode a man who was, depending on who you asked, either a braggadocious charlatan or the only reason anyone survived at all. His name was Captain John Smith. Smith was not a gentleman. He was a soldier of fortune, a man of action, a seasoned veteran of wars across Europe. He had, by his own colorful account, fought Turks, been enslaved, escaped by killing his master, and trekked across Russia. His autobiography reads like the most unbelievable action movie ever written, and while he almost certainly embellished the details, the core of the man was undeniably tough, pragmatic, and utterly unimpressed by the delicate sensibilities of the gentleman. He looked at the gold-obsessed fops dying around him and saw the fatal flaw in the entire enterprise. While others were digging for phantom riches, Smith was exploring, mapping the rivers, and, most importantly, dealing with the Powhatan. He understood, in a way the others didn't, that survival depended not on finding gold, but on finding food. And the people who had the food were the natives. His approach to diplomacy was direct. It was a volatile cocktail of threats, bluff, and occasional, grudging respect. He would sail up to a village, point a musket, and demand corn. It was gangster diplomacy, a high-stakes negotiation where one wrong move could get everyone killed. And yet, it often worked. The Powhatan, for their part, seemed to have a complex view of Smith. They respected his boldness, a quality they valued, even as they resented his intrusions. There's the famous, and almost certainly heavily romanticized, story of his capture by Powhatan's men and his life being saved by the chief's young daughter, Pocahontas. Whether she truly threw herself over him to stop the execution or if this was a symbolic adoption ceremony that Smith, in his European ignorance, misinterpreted as a rescue, is a matter of intense historical debate. What is clear is that a relationship was formed. Pocahontas became an occasional emissary between the two worlds, bringing food to the starving fort and acting as a bridge over a chasm of cultural misunderstanding. But Smith's most important contribution was his leadership within the fort itself. He saw the indolence, the class-based refusal to work, and he imposed a new, revolutionary rule, one that struck at the very heart of the gentleman's identity: he that will not work, shall not eat. It was brutal, it was simple, and it was effective. He forced the pampered aristocrats to pick up axes and hoes. He organized work gangs to build, to plant, to fortify. He was, in modern terms, the turnaround CEO from hell, the toxic boss who, infuriatingly, gets results. He bullied and cajoled and threatened the colony into a state of functional survival. There was grumbling, there were plots against his life, but there was also, for the first time, a sense of order and purpose. Under Smith's abrasive command, Jamestown stabilized. The death rate slowed. The fort was repaired. They had a small but steady supply of food, thanks to his aggressive trade in the forced labor. They were still miserable, still living on the edge, but they were, for the moment, alive. This fragile stability, however, was entirely dependent on one man's force of will. Smith was the linchpin holding the whole rickety structure together. And then, in a moment of pure, absurd misfortune, the linchpin was removed. Smith was badly injured in a freak accident. A stray spark ignited his gunpowder bag while he was sleeping in a boat, resulting in a horrific burn down his leg. The injury was severe, and the crude medical facilities at Jamestown were wholly inadequate to treat it. In agony and facing the prospect of a slow, infected death, Smith had no choice but to return to England for treatment. He sailed away, leaving a power vacuum in his wake. His departure was the equivalent of pulling the plug on a life support machine. The colonists watched his ship disappear over the horizon, likely with mixed emotions. The gentlemen were probably thrilled to be rid of the commoner who had forced them to dirty their hands. They could finally get back to the important business of doing nothing. They had no idea they were cheering their own death sentence. The timing could not have been worse. Smith left just as autumn was setting in. The corn they had planted was not enough. The relationship with the Powhatan, which had always been a tense tightrope walk, was now left in the hands of men who had all the diplomatic finesse of a charging rhino. Without Smith's intimidating presence, the Powhatan saw no reason to continue trading. Why prop up this nest of strange, sickly intruders? Instead, they decided to implement a new strategy: containment. They would cut the English off, a siege not of walls, but of the wilderness itself. They killed any colonists who strayed too far from the fort. They slaughtered their livestock, the precious few pigs and chickens that roamed outside the palisades. They wanted the English to wither and die, or simply go away. As the leaves turned from green to gold to brown, a new fleet of ships arrived from England. This should have been a moment of joyous relief. More people, more supplies. But the universe, in its infinite capacity for cruel jokes, had other plans. This fleet had been scattered by a hurricane. The flagship, the Sea Venture, carrying most of the supplies and all of the new leadership, was wrecked in Bermuda. The other ships limped into Jamestown, carrying a few hundred more mouths to feed and almost no food to give them. The population of the fort swelled, while the food stores plummeted. They were now more crowded, more desperate, and their one competent leader was an ocean away. The stage was set. The actors were in place. The doors of the fort were barred, not just against the Powhatan, but against a world that had seemingly abandoned them. Winter was coming, and with it, a hunger so profound, so all-consuming, that it would drive them to erase the very lines that separated man from beast, civilization from savagery. The starving time was about to begin. The onset of that winter was deceptively gentle. The first cold snap was a novelty, a crisp reminder of the English autumns they had left behind. But as the days grew shorter and the nights deepened into a profound, chilling black, a new kind of cold began to settle in, the cold of a truly empty larder. The last of the corn, hoarded with a miser's desperation, was gone. The communal storehouse, the heart of the colony, was a hollow, echoing space. Its emptiness was a physical presence, a ghost that haunted their every waking moment. The initial response was predictable. They organized hunting parties. But the Powhatan siege was brutally effective. The forests around Jamestown, once a potential source of game, were now a no man's land. Any Englishman who ventured out in search of a squirrel or a deer was likely to be met with a silent arrow from the trees. The hunters who did return came back empty-handed and terrified, with stories of shadows moving in the woods and the glint of unseen eyes. The great, bountiful wilderness of Virginia had become a cage. They turned to the river. But it was winter. The fish were scarce, sluggish in the cold water. Their nets, often in poor repair, came up empty time and time again. Each failed attempt was another turn of the screw, another small death of hope. The river that had poisoned them in the summer now starved them in the winter. It was a relentlessly malevolent feature of the landscape. With the wild sources exhausted, they turned inward, looking at the resources within the fort's palisades. The first to go were the animals they had brought with them, the last living links to their old lives. The chickens, then the precious few pigs that hadn't been picked off by the Powhatan. Then came the dogs and the cats. These were not just livestock. In many cases, they were pets, companions that had shared the misery of the voyage and the settlement. The decision to slaughter them was a grim one. You can imagine the scene, a man looking at the dog that had greeted him faithfully every morning, its tail wagging in ignorant bliss, and seeing not a friend, but a few pounds of stringy meat. The act of butchering a companion animal must have felt like a small, personal surrender to the savagery that was closing in. But hunger is a master that tolerates no sentimentality. Soon, even the dogs and cats were gone. And the hunger returned, sharper this time, more demanding. It was no longer a simple discomfort. It was a physical torment. It was a hollow ache in the belly that radiated outwards, colonizing every thought, every sensation. It was the dizziness when you stood up too fast, the weakness in your limbs, the fog in your brain that made simple tasks feel like monumental challenges. It was the constant, obsessive calculation. Where's the next mouthful coming from? What have I not yet considered eating? The answer was rats and mice. The very vermin they had cursed on the voyage over became a prized delicacy. They hunted them through the floorboards and in the thatch of their roofs. A man who caught a rat was a king for a day, guarding his prize with paranoid jealousy. They would be cooked over a pitiful fire, the tiny sizzle of their flesh a symphony to starving ears, the greasy smoke an intoxicating perfume. They were eaten down to the last tiny bone, the last scrap of sinew. Every calorie was a treasure. The fort became a landscape of scavengers. People's eyes, sunk deep into their skulls, were constantly scanning the ground. They were looking for anything. An acorn that had been missed. A grub unearthed from the frozen soil. A piece of discarded trash that might, with enough boiling, yield some faint nutritional ghost. The social order, already fragile, began to disintegrate completely. The concept of community evaporated, replaced by a desperate, atomized struggle for individual survival. A man with a hidden crust of bread was not a friend to be helped, but an enemy to be watched, a resource to be potentially plundered. The communal fires dwindled as people hoarded their own small stashes of firewood, unwilling to share. The sounds of the fort changed. The boisterous shouts and hammering of the early days were replaced by a deadening silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the wattle and daub walls, the hacking coughs of the sick, and the low, constant moaning of the hungry. The gentlemen, who had once debated points of etiquette and precedence, were now just as gaunt and desperate as the laborers they had once commanded. Hunger is a great equalizer. It stripped them of their silks and their titles, reducing them all to the same primal state, a creature that needs to eat. They were trapped. Trapped by the Powhatan outside, trapped by the winter, and most of all, trapped by their own cascading series of bad decisions. They had sailed across an ocean in search of a fairy tale, and now they were living in a horror story, turning the pages one agonizing, empty day at a time. The unthinkable was still, at this point, unthinkable. But the line was getting closer. With every new hunger pang, with every failed hunt, with every friend who died of starvation, that line became a little fainter, a little easier to imagine crossing. The beast was at the door, and it was whispering suggestions. When the rats and mice were gone, when the last of the acorns had been ground into a bitter, unpalatable meal, the colonists entered a new and terrifying phase of culinary desperation. They began to look at their own material world not as a collection of objects, but as a potential menu. The very fabric of their constructed civilization was about to be consumed. The first item on this bizarre new bill of fare was leather. Shoes, belts, jerkins, scraps from the armorer's workshop, anything made from the hide of an animal was now considered food. This was not a simple matter of chewing on a shoelace. This was a grim, laborious process. The leather, hard and chemically treated, had to be boiled for hours, sometimes days, in the precious brackish water from the river. The goal was to break it down, to soften it, to release any microscopic vestige of the animal it once was. The process filled the cramped, smoky huts with a foul, acrid stench, the smell of desperation being rendered into a barely edible slurry. The resulting meal was a gelatinous, vile-tasting goo. It had almost zero nutritional value, but it was something to put in the stomach. It was a way to trick the body, for a little while, into thinking it had been fed. The psychological toll of this must have been immense. Imagine a man, his feet wrapped in rags to protect them from the frozen ground, carefully cutting up his last pair of boots, the very boots that had walked him from the ship to this forsaken place, and boiling them for his dinner. It was an act of profound self-destruction, dismantling the tools of survival in order to survive for one more day. It was the logic of a man trapped in a burning building, tearing up the floorboards to feed the fire for a few more moments of warmth. After the leather, they turned to anything with even a hint of organic matter. They ate the ruffs from around their necks, the starched linen collars that were the last symbol of their gentility. These were boiled down until the starch created a thin, watery gruel. It was like eating ghosts, swallowing the last vestiges of their former identities. The hunger was now more than a physical sensation, it was a form of madness. It induced hallucinations. Men would stare into the fire and see feasts. They would dream of London bakeries, of roasted meats and pies, only to wake up to the gnawing emptiness and the foul taste of boiled leather in their mouths. The waking world was the nightmare. The dreams were the only escape. Paranoia reached a fever pitch. A man who looked slightly less skeletal than his neighbor was viewed with deep suspicion. Was he hiding food? Did he have a secret stash of rats? Or had he found some other, darker source of nourishment? Accusations flew in weak, raspy whispers. Friendships dissolved into a primal distrust. The fort was no longer a community. It was a collection of solitary prisoners, each locked in a cell of their own starvation. The physical transformation of the colonists was horrific. Their skin, stretched taut over their bones, took on a yellowish, translucent quality. Their eyes, sunk deep into their sockets, burned with a feverish light. Their bellies became bloated and distended, a cruel paradox of starvation known as edema. They were walking skeletons, animated by a single, desperate will to live. Death became a mundane, everyday occurrence. A man would simply lie down in his hut and not get up again. There was no energy for funerals, no strength for proper burials. The dead were often left where they fell for days, their bodies a silent testament to the colony's failure. The survivors were too weak, too apathetic, too consumed with their own slow-motion demise to afford the dead any dignity. The living looked at the dead with a horrifyingly practical gaze. The sight of a corpse no longer inspired grief or fear, but a different, more terrible thought. A thought that had likely been lurking in the back of their minds for weeks, a whisper that was now growing into a roar. The line between a dead friend and a potential source of calories began to blur. The most sacred taboo of human society, the one that separates us from the direst savagery, was being worn down by the constant, grinding pressure of an empty gut. They had eaten their animals. They had eaten their clothes. They had eaten their shoes. There was only one source of meat left inside the walls of Jamestown. The unthinkable was no longer a matter of if, but when, and who. The winter ground on, relentless and unforgiving. The population, which had swelled to around 500 with the arrival of the last fleet, was now plummeting. Every sunrise revealed new corpses. The fort was a charnel house, a monument to a dream that had died and was now beginning to putrefy. They were at the absolute bottom, the nadir of human experience. And it was in this pit of despair that one of them would make a choice, or have a choice made for them, that would echo through history and forever stain the name of Jamestown. The moment had come to eat the unthinkable. The final barrier of civilization did not collapse in a single, dramatic moment. It eroded slowly, eaten away by the relentless acid of starvation. The decision to resort to cannibalism was likely not made in a council or by committee. It was a series of quiet, desperate, individual choices made in the darkest corners of the fort, shielded from the eyes of God and what little remained of human society. The first instances were probably acts of grim opportunism. A neighbor dies in the night. The survivors, too weak to dig a grave in the frozen earth, are left alone with the body. In the crushing silence of their hut, with the wind howling outside and the fire reduced to a few dying embers, the corpse ceases to be a person. It becomes an object, a collection of protein and fat, a resource that is just lying there, waiting to be used. The first cut would have been the hardest, a violation of every instinct, every moral and religious teaching they had ever known. But once that line was crossed, the second cut would have been easier. And the third, easier still. Hunger is a powerful anesthetic for the conscience. The accounts from the survivors are, understandably, cagey and vague. George Percy, who was the colony's leader during this time, a man utterly out of his depth and presiding over a slow-motion apocalypse, wrote of it with a kind of horrified detachment. He described how the starving colonists began by digging up the recently buried bodies from their shallow graves. The frozen ground was their new larder. This was the first step down a very dark path, scavenging the already dead. It was ghoulish, it was horrifying, but it still maintained a sliver of moral distinction. They were not murdering, they were merely recycling. But as the buried corpses were consumed, and the living continued to die, the logic of starvation pushed them further. Percy speaks of men and women who were murdered for their meat. He tells a story, a particularly gruesome one, of a man who killed his pregnant wife, salted her, and had eaten part of her before he was discovered. His crime was not just the cannibalism, but the murder that preceded it. For this, he was executed in a manner befitting the horror of his actions, burned at the stake. The story is so shocking that for centuries, some historians questioned its veracity. Was it an exaggeration, a piece of Gothic horror designed to shock the readers back in England? Or was it the literal truth of how far things had fallen? The evidence for cannibalism at Jamestown remained, for a very long time, purely textual. It was based on the writings of Percy and a few others. It was easy for later generations, living in comfort and plenty, to dismiss it as hyperbole. But history has a way of leaving receipts, often in the most unexpected of places. For centuries, the story of the man who ate his wife was the most vivid image of the starving time. But the most scientifically concrete, and in some ways more chilling, evidence would not be uncovered until the modern era. It would come in the form of a young girl, a victim whose story was written not in ink, but in the butcher's marks on her own bones. In a cellar, amidst a pile of refuse from the starving time, the bones of butchered dogs and cats, the remnants of their desperate meals, archaeologists found something else. It was the partial skeleton of a girl, about 14 years old. They named her Jane. Jane was not a name she had in life. It was a name given to her by the scientists who had pieced together the final, terrible moments of her existence. And her skeleton told a story more eloquent and horrifying than any written account. The forensic analysis of her skull and tibia was methodical and chilling. It revealed a pattern not of random violence, but of systematic, purposeful dismemberment. There were tentative, hesitant cuts on her forehead and the back of her skull, the hesitation marks of someone unused to the task, steeling themselves to split the skull open to get at the brain, a fatty, calorie-rich organ. Then there were the more confident, decisive chops to the jaw and the front of the skull, signs that the butcher had overcome their initial reluctance. The cuts were precise, aimed at separating the facial muscles and tongue. Her shin bone showed similar marks, clear evidence of the flesh being stripped from the bone in the same way a butcher would process a deer or a pig. This was not an act of rage. It was an act of food preparation. The person who did this was not a crazed killer. They were a desperate, starving survivor, treating a human body as a source of sustenance. The location where Jane's remains were found is also telling. She was in a trash pit, discarded along with the other animal bones. There was no ceremony, no burial. She was, in the end, refused. The evidence suggests that Jane had already died, likely from starvation or disease, before her body was cannibalized. Like the others exhumed from their graves, she was probably a resource of opportunity. But the cold, clinical evidence on her bones provides irrefutable proof of the darkest chapter of the Jamestown story. It transforms the starving time from a grim tale into a forensic fact. Jane's silent testimony speaks volumes. It tells of a society that had completely collapsed, where the living were forced to prey upon the dead to see the next sunrise. It speaks of a hunger so absolute that it erased a 14-year-old girl's identity, reducing her to a collection of edible parts. She is the face of the starving time, the symbol of a colonial dream that had festered into an unspeakable nightmare. The fort had become a place of silent, creeping horror, where the living envied the dead for their peace, and then ate them. The story of Jane provides the grim, scientific anchor for the horrors of the starving time, but the human reality behind it was a landscape of daily, grinding misery. Imagine the psychology of the survivors during that period. Each day was a mirror of the last. You would wake, not from a restful sleep, but from a state of torpor, a low-energy hibernation. The first sensation would be the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, a familiar, monstrous companion. The second would be the cold, a damp, penetrating chill that no amount of threadbare blankets could keep at bay. The hut would be dark, the only light filtering through the cracks in the daub, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air. The air itself would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, sickness, and something else, the faint, coppery tang of death, a smell that now clung to everything. Your body would be an alien landscape of pain and weakness. Your joints would ache. Your muscles, atrophied from malnutrition and inactivity, would barely obey your commands. Standing up would be a slow, deliberate process, often accompanied by a wave of dizziness that threatened to send you sprawling back onto your flea-ridden pallet. Looking at your own reflection in a bucket of stagnant water would be to confront a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed ghoul with parchment-like skin and hair falling out in clumps. There was no concept of a future beyond the next few hours. The grand ambitions of finding gold or a passage to the Orient were a laughable, distant memory from another lifetime. The only ambition now was to find a single calorie. The day would be structured around the singular, desperate quest. A slow, shambling walk around the perimeter of the fort, eyes scanning the frozen mud for anything at all. A forgotten root, a piece of frozen fungus, a single, lonely insect. The discovery of such a treasure would be the high point of the day, a jolt of primal triumph in a sea of despair. The social fabric was not just torn, it was atomized. You would not look at your fellow survivors as comrades in suffering. You would look at them as competition. You would watch them with a hawk-like intensity. Did they find something? Are they hiding it? Their weakness was your opportunity. Their death was, in the coldest calculus of survival, one less mouth to feed. Conversation would have dwindled to the bare essentials, uttered in weak, raspy voices. There was no energy for pleasantries, for stories, for songs. The silence of the fort would be a heavy, oppressive blanket. The only sounds would be the wind, the crackle of a meager fire, the rattling cough of someone in the final stages of pneumonia, the quiet, desperate weeping of someone who had finally lost all hope. The act of cannibalism itself, now a known and accepted reality within the fort, would have created its own unique brand of psychological terror. You would have to wonder about the source of the meat that a neighbor might, in a rare moment of communal sharing, offer you. You would have to look at the living and wonder who might be next. You would have to look at your own emaciated body and understand that, to others, you were not just a fellow sufferer, but a potential future meal. The fort was a pressure cooker of paranoia and dread. George Percy wrote that some were so desperate they would lick up the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows. The image is medieval in its horror. It speaks to a level of degradation that is difficult to comprehend. The very essence of humanity, the empathy and compassion that bind us together, had been boiled away, leaving only the raw, twitching nerve of self-preservation. The world had shrunk to the size of the triangular fort. The vast continent outside, with its forests and rivers, might as well have been the moon. The Powhatan siege was absolute. The colonists were prisoners in a jail of their own making, sentenced to a slow, lingering death by starvation. The seasons, which should have been a source of comfort and renewal, were just another instrument of torture. The winter sun, low and weak in the sky, offered no warmth. The snow, when it fell, was not a beautiful white blanket, but another obstacle, another layer of cold to seep into their bones, another hardship to endure. They were counting the days, not towards a rescue they no longer believed in, but towards their own end. Of the roughly 500 souls in Jamestown at the beginning of the winter, only about 60 would survive to see the spring. It was a decimation, a near total annihilation of the colony. The starving time was an object lesson in failure, a failure of planning, a failure of leadership, a failure of diplomacy, and ultimately, a failure of the human spirit to withstand the absolute extremes of deprivation. The dream of Virginia had become a charnel house, a place of such profound horror that it would take an act of near-divine intervention to prevent it from being wiped off the map entirely, its story swallowed by the swamp and the forest, leaving behind only the silent, screaming testimony of bones like chains. As the brutal winter finally began to loosen its icy grip, giving way to a muddy, anemic spring, the state of the 60 or so survivors was beyond dire. They were not jubilant. They were not relieved. They were hollowed-out husks of human beings, traumatized, skeletal, and barely clinging to a thread of existence. The coming of spring did not bring an immediate bounty. The ground was still cold and wet, the game was still wary, and they were far too weak to mount any serious effort at planting or hunting. They were ghosts haunting the ruins of their own ambition. The fort itself was a scene from a nightmare. The carefully constructed palisades were crumbling. The huts were dilapidated, their daub walls cracked and fallen away. The central square was a wasteland of filth, debris, and human waste. The unburied dead, or the partially consumed remains of the dead, were a common sight. The air was thick with the stench of decay. It was a place that radiated failure, a wound on the landscape that refused to heal. The survivors moved like specters through this ruin, their movements slow and listless. The psychological scars were as deep as the physical ones. They were haunted by what they had seen, and more terribly, by what they had done. How do you look a man in the eye when you know you ate his brother to survive? How do you rebuild a community on a foundation of such profound horror? The bonds of trust that are essential for any society to function had been completely incinerated. Every survivor was an island, isolated by their own traumatic memories. They were likely suffering from a profound form of collective PTSD, a shared madness born of unspeakable experience. They were waiting, not for a miracle, but for the end. They had no food, no hope, and no strength to change their circumstances. Jamestown was on the verge of becoming another lost colony, a historical mystery for future generations to ponder. But then, in a moment that must have seemed like a fevered dream, a hallucination brought on by their prolonged starvation, something happened. A ship appeared on the river. This was not a supply ship from England. It was a smaller vessel, a pinnace. And as it drew closer, the emaciated figures on the shore would have recognized the men on board. It was the leadership from the Sea Venture, the flagship that had been lost in the hurricane months before. Sir Thomas Gates and the other survivors of the Bermuda shipwreck had arrived. They had not, as was assumed, been lost at sea. They had wrecked on the shores of Bermuda, an island paradise teeming with food, wild pigs, turtles, birds, and fish. While their countrymen in Jamestown were boiling their shoes and eating their dead, the Sea Venture survivors had been living in relative comfort, building 2 new ships, the Patience and the Deliverance, from the wreckage of their old one and the island's cedar trees. Their story was one of miraculous survival and ingenuity. It would later inspire Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. But the scene that greeted them at Jamestown was no play. It was a tragedy of the starkest kind. Gates and his men, healthy and well-fed, stepped ashore into a nightmare. They found not a thriving colony, but a handful of skeletal wretches stumbling through a ruin. The contrast between the 2 groups of survivors could not have been more stark. It was as if 2 different worlds had collided. Gates was appalled. He had expected to find hardship, but not this. Not a charnel house. Not the vacant, haunted eyes of men who had been to hell and had not quite come back. The 60 Jamestown survivors were in such a poor state that they were beyond saving in their current location. The few provisions that Gates had brought with him from Bermuda would not last long among so many. The fort was unsanitary, the morale was non-existent, and the land itself seemed cursed. After a quick and horrified assessment of the situation, Gates made a drastic decision. The Jamestown experiment was over. It was a failure. He gave the order to abandon the colony. This was a momentous decision. To give up on the first permanent English settlement in the New World. To admit defeat to the wilderness, to the hunger, to their own incompetence. The survivors, however, were probably too far gone to care about the geopolitical implications. The promise of leaving this cursed place, of getting on a ship and sailing away, anywhere, must have been the first good news they had heard in a lifetime. They began the process of packing up, which couldn't have taken long, as they had almost no possessions left. They were ordered not to burn the fort, holding out a sliver of hope that the English might one day return. They boarded the Patience and the Deliverance, a ragged, skeletal crew, turning their backs on the sight of so much suffering. As they sailed down the James River, away from the stinking, corpse-littered swamp they had called home, it must have felt like a release. They had survived the starving time. They were leaving the ghosts behind. The story of Jamestown was over. Or so they thought. The universe, it seems, has a wickedly ironic sense of timing. The cruel God who had overseen their torment had one last, unbelievable twist in store for them. As the two small ships, the Patience and the Deliverance, carried the last ragged survivors of Jamestown down the river towards the open sea, the mood on board was likely one of quiet, exhausted relief. They were leaving a graveyard. They were escaping a nightmare. Their destination was Newfoundland, where they hoped to find the English fishing fleets and beg for passage home. The Virginia enterprise, in their minds, was a closed book, a tragic and costly failure. They had been sailing for less than a day. They had not yet even reached the Chesapeake Bay. As they rounded a bend in the river, another ship appeared on the horizon, sailing towards them. Then another. And another. It was a fleet. And flying from the masts were English flags. This was Lord de la Warr, a new governor, arriving from England with 3 ships, a year's worth of supplies, and hundreds of fresh colonists and soldiers. He had been sent by the Virginia Company, who, blissfully unaware of the absolute apocalypse that had unfolded, were doubling down on their investment. De la Warr, a stern and aristocratic figure, was essentially the new CEO brought in to execute a much more aggressive and militarized business plan. His arrival at that exact moment is one of the most staggering coincidences in colonial history. Had Gates and the survivors left a day earlier, they would have missed him completely. Had de la Warr arrived a day later, he would have found a silent, empty fort, and likely would have turned around and sailed home himself. The history of the entire continent could have been different. But fate, or sheer, dumb luck, had them meet in the middle of the James River. You can only imagine the scene. The disbelief on both sides. De la Warr's men, fresh from England, full of purpose and colonial ambition, encountering these 2 small, patched-up ships carrying what looked like a crew of skeletons, fleeing the very place they were headed. And the Jamestown survivors, who had just made their peace with abandoning the whole project, being told, "No, turn around. You're going back." It must have felt like a cosmic joke of the cruelest kind. A pardon arriving moments after the execution. De la Warr, a man not known for his sentimentality, listened to their tale of horror, assessed the situation, and issued his first command as governor. There would be no retreat. Everyone was going back to Jamestown. He had the supplies, he had the manpower, and he had the will to see it through. For the 60 traumatized survivors, this order must have been devastating. To be forced to return to the very ground that held their darkest memories, the place of their utter degradation. To have to walk back into the dilapidated, stinking fort that they had just escaped. It was like being dragged back into the jaws of a monster they had just pried themselves from. But they had no choice. De la Warr was the new authority. His fleet represented the full power of the Virginia Company and the Crown. And so, the small flotilla turned around. The Patience and the Deliverance, which had been carrying the survivors to freedom, now led them back to their prison. They re-landed at Jamestown. De la Warr's first actions were swift and decisive. He was a military man, and he ran the colony like an army barracks. He surveyed the squalor of the fort and was disgusted. He immediately ordered a massive cleanup. The streets were cleared of filth. The dead were properly buried. The chapel was repaired, and mandatory church services were held twice a day. He imposed a harsh new set of laws, later published as the Laws Divine, Moral, and Martial. These were not suggestions, they were ironclad rules. Work was no longer optional, it was compulsory, with set hours and tasks assigned by commanders. Failure to work was punishable by whipping. Stealing food was punishable by death. Criticizing the governor or the Virginia Company could get you a flogging or worse. It was a totalitarian regime imposed on a traumatized population. The easygoing, if chaotic, days of the early colony were over. This was Jamestown 2.0, a much harder, more disciplined, and more brutal enterprise. De La Warre's arrival, with his supplies and his soldiers, saved Jamestown from extinction. He brought order, he brought food, and he brought a renewed, if ruthless, sense of purpose. But he also brought war. His approach to the Powhatan was not one of negotiation or trade. It was one of conquest. He saw the natives not as potential partners, but as an enemy to be subjugated. He launched a series of brutal raids on Powhatan villages, burning their cornfields, destroying their homes, and killing their people. This new, aggressive policy ignited the First Anglo-Powhatan War, a bloody conflict that would drag on for years, adding a new layer of violence and misery to the Virginia landscape. The starving time was over, but the suffering was not. The hunger of the belly had been replaced by the violence of the sword. The colony had been safe from imploding, but it had done so by becoming something harder, colder, and more aggressive. The few original survivors who remained were now trapped in a new kind of hell, a militarized camp, ruled by fear, in the middle of a war zone. They had endured the unthinkable, only to find themselves pawns in a new, and equally brutal, game. The dream of a golden paradise was well and truly dead, replaced by the grim reality of a colonial foothold maintained by iron will and bloodshed. The new regime under Lord de La Warre, while saving the colony from immediate annihilation, transformed Jamestown into a place that was arguably just as miserable, albeit in a different flavor. The lethargic, despair-filled misery of the starving time was replaced by a rigid, militaristic misery. The laws divine, moral, and martial were less a legal code and more a manual for a penal colony. The day was regimented by the beat of a drum. At the appointed hour, the colonists would be marched out to the fields or to their construction duties in work gangs, overseen by armed guards. The freedom that many had imagined they would find in the New World had been replaced by a system more restrictive than anything they had known in England. A man couldn't even swear without risking a painful punishment, like having a bodkin, a large, sharp needle, driven through his tongue. The goal was to beat the laziness and indiscipline out of the colonists, to forge them into a productive, obedient workforce. But it also crushed any remaining flicker of individual spirit. The 60 or so survivors of the starving time, already deeply traumatized, were now subjected to this new form of psychological pressure. They were cogs in a machine, their individual lives and well-being secondary to the grand project of the Virginia Company. Food was no longer a desperate, individual quest. It was centrally controlled and distributed as rations, doled out by the authorities. This prevented starvation, but it also reinforced the colonists' powerlessness. They were utterly dependent on the company store, a system that would define labor in many parts of America for centuries to come. This new, harsh approach also permanently altered the relationship with the Powhatan. The uneasy truce and occasional trade of the John Smith era were gone. The containment strategy of the starving time had now erupted into open, total war. De La Warre's tactics were merciless. He engaged in what would today be called feed fights, deliberately targeting the natives' food supplies. English soldiers would raid villages, specifically to burn their cornfields right before harvest. The goal was to starve the Powhatan into submission, to use the very weapon against them that they had so effectively used against the English. It was a strategy of calculated cruelty. The colonists, who had so recently known the agonies of starvation themselves, were now being ordered to inflict that same agony on others. This must have created a profound cognitive dissonance, or perhaps it simply brutalized them further, hardening them to the suffering of anyone outside their own group. The landscape outside the fort, once a place of cautious exploration, became a theater of war. The quiet woods now echoed with the crack of muskets and the screams of the dying. Life in Jamestown became a life under siege, not from hunger, but from a state of perpetual, low-grade warfare. Fear was a constant companion. The fear of an ambush if you strayed too far from the palisades, the fear of a raid on the fort itself. The new colonists, soldiers many of them, were veterans of the brutal wars in Ireland and the Netherlands, and they brought that same ruthless mindset to Virginia. They saw the Powhatan not as a sovereign people defending their land, but as savages impeding progress, an obstacle to be removed. This ideology provided the moral justification for acts of extreme violence. One infamous incident illustrates the new level of brutality. An English captain captured a Powhatan queen and her children. After his men began to murmur about the inconvenience of keeping prisoners, he had the children thrown overboard into the river and then shot them as they tried to swim. The queen was taken back to Jamestown and later executed. This was not a battle, it was a massacre. It was terrorism, designed to break the will of the Powhatan people. The Starving Time, for all its internal horror, was a story of the English against nature and their own incompetence. The period that followed was the story of the English against the native inhabitants of the land. The colony survived, yes, but its survival was predicated on a new foundation of violence and dispossession. It set a grim precedent for the centuries of conflict that would follow as the frontier expanded. For the handful of original survivors still alive, this must have been a bewildering transformation. They had come seeking gold, endured a biblical famine, and now found themselves as foot soldiers in a dirty, brutal war of conquest. Their personal dreams and ambitions were utterly irrelevant. They were simply trying to stay alive in a world that seemed determined to kill them, one way or another. Lord Delaware himself did not last long in Virginia. The same swampy climate that had decimated the original colonists soon took its toll on him. He fell ill with dysentery and fever and was forced to return to England, leaving his brutal legal code and his war strategy in the hands of his deputies. The colony would continue on this new, harder path. The focus shifted away from the fool's errand of finding gold and towards a more realistic, if less glamorous, goal: finding a profitable commodity. The future of Virginia would not be built on a precious metal, but on a noxious weed. The cultivation of a particularly sweet strain of tobacco, introduced by a colonist named John Rolfe, would finally provide the Virginia Company with the economic engine it so desperately needed. Tobacco would make the colony profitable, which would attract more investment and more colonists. It would be the salvation of Virginia, but it was a salvation that required vast amounts of land and labor, putting even more pressure on the native populations and eventually leading to the mass importation of enslaved Africans. The seeds of the future American South, with its plantation economy and its deep-seated racial conflicts, were sown in the ashes of the Starving Time. The unspeakable horror of that winter was a crucible. It burned away the naive, get-rich-quick dreams of the first adventurers. what emerged from the fire was something leaner, meaner, and far more ruthless. The colony had to nearly destroy itself before it could find the formula for survival, a formula based on military discipline, total war, and an addictive cash crop. The ghosts of the starving time and the specter of Jane would forever haunt the foundations of the settlement, a silent reminder of the catastrophic price of admission to the New World. The introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe truly marks the pivot point for the colony's long-term viability, but it's a story that's intertwined with the final chapters of the immediate starving time aftermath. John Rolfe himself was one of the survivors from the shipwrecked Sea Venture. He had been one of the lucky ones who spent the winter in the paradise of Bermuda while Jamestown starved. He arrived with Sir Thomas Gates, a widower whose wife and child had died during the journey. Rolfe was a thoughtful, pious, and intensely practical man. He was also a savvy agriculturalist. He saw that the native tobacco, while plentiful, was too harsh and bitter for European tastes. He somehow managed to acquire seeds for a sweeter, more palatable strain from the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, an act that was technically a state crime, as Spain guarded its tobacco monopoly with jealous ferocity. He began experimenting with cultivating this new strain in the fertile Virginia soil. The results were spectacular. The plant thrived in the hot, humid climate. The leaves, when cured, produced a smooth, aromatic smoke that was an instant sensation when the first shipments reached London. Suddenly, Virginia had a product. It had its gold, and it was green and leafy. This discovery was more valuable than any mine. It created a tobacco boom, a frantic rush to plant as much of the crop as possible. Land that had previously been used to grow life-sustaining corn was quickly converted to tobacco fields. The colonists, who had recently been starving, were now so obsessed with their cash crop that the authorities had to pass laws forcing them to plant a certain amount of corn, lest they recreate the famine through sheer, profit-driven negligence. It was a classic case of forgetting the lessons of history in the face of a get-rich-quick scheme that actually worked. The economic salvation brought by tobacco also had a profound impact on the ongoing war with the Powhatan. The thirst for tobacco profits created an insatiable hunger for land. Tobacco farming rapidly exhausts the soil, meaning new fields had to be constantly cleared. This put the English in direct and escalating conflict with the Powhatan over territory. The war, which had begun as a series of punitive raids under De La Warr, now became a systematic campaign to push the natives off their ancestral lands to make way for plantations. It was in this tense atmosphere of war and tobacco fever that one of the most famous episodes in early American history occurred, the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. This wasn't a simple love story, as it's often portrayed. It was a complex political maneuver. Pocahontas had been captured by the English and held as a hostage in Jamestown for over a year. During her captivity, she was instructed in Christianity, baptized with the name Rebecca, and assimilated into English culture. Rolfe, a devout man, wrote a long, angst-ridden letter to the governor asking for permission to marry her, framing it not as a matter of personal desire, but as a holy mission to save her soul and bring peace between their two peoples. The governor and Chief Powhatan both saw the strategic value in such a union. The marriage created a temporary truce, a period of fragile peace known as the Peace of Pocahontas. It was a moment of hope, a brief respite from the cycle of violence. For a few years, the two cultures coexisted in a state of uneasy calm. The English were able to expand their plantations without fear of attack, and the Powhatan were able to regroup and trade. Rolfe and Rebecca even traveled to England with their young son, Thomas. She was presented at the court of King James I as a civilized savage, a living embodiment of the Virginia Company's supposed success in converting the natives. She was a celebrity, a symbol of the potential for a harmonious new world. Tragically, the story does not have a happy ending. Just as they were preparing to return to Virginia, Rebecca fell ill, likely with pneumonia or tuberculosis, and died in England. She was buried in a churchyard in Gravesend, never to see her homeland again. Her death was a personal tragedy for Rolfe, but it was also a symbolic blow to the fragile peace she represented. Her father, the great Chief Powhatan, died shortly after, heartbroken and weary. The leadership of the Powhatan Confederacy passed to his more militant brother, Opechancanough, who had long harbored a deep and patient hatred for the English intruders. The peace of Pocahontas died with her. The calm was just the deep breath before the plunge. Opechancanough watched as the English, fueled by tobacco money, poured into Virginia in ever-increasing numbers. He saw his people's lands being taken, their way of life being eroded. He began to plan, in secret, a massive, coordinated strike designed to wipe the English colony off the face of the earth once and for all. He was playing the long game. For the survivors of the starving time, this period must have been a whirlwind. They had gone from cannibalism to a cash crop boom. They had gone from total war to a fragile peace brokered by a celebrity marriage. They were witnessing the birth of a new kind of society, a plantation society, built on a single, addictive plant. The colony was no longer a tiny, struggling fort. It was expanding, sending out tendrils of settlement up and down the James River. The fundamental problem, however, remained. The English were building their success on land that was not theirs, and the original inhabitants were being pushed to a breaking point. The horrors of the starving time were born from the colonists' inability to feed themselves. The new horrors that were brewing were born from their newfound success, and the greed and arrogance that came with it. The temporary peace was an illusion. It was the calm surface of a deep, turbulent ocean of resentment, and the storm was about to break with a terrifying fury. The peace that followed the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas lulled the English colonists into a dangerous sense of security. The tobacco boom was in full swing, and the colony was spreading out from the central hub of Jamestown. Small, scattered plantations and settlements sprang up along the James River, isolated and vulnerable. The colonists, focused on their crops and profits, let their guard down. They stopped building palisades, they let their weapons rust, and they began to mingle more freely with the native population, often inviting them into their homes to trade. They had forgotten the hard-won lessons of the past. They had forgotten that they were living on someone else's land, and that their presence was tolerated, not welcomed. The new Powhatan leader, Opechancanough, was a master strategist. He nurtured this illusion of peace for years. He engaged in trade, he participated in diplomatic exchanges, and he gave the English every reason to believe that the conflict was over. All the while, he was secretly coordinating a plan of breathtaking scale and ambition. He sent messengers to all the tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy, from the Potomac River to the south of the James, organizing a simultaneous surprise attack. The goal was simple and brutal: to kill as many of the English as possible, in as short a time as possible, to shatter their morale and drive the survivors back into the sea. The date was set for a specific day in late winter. On the morning of the attack, the Powhatan warriors entered the English settlements as they often did, unarmed, with goods to trade: venison, furs, turkeys. They sat down at the breakfast tables of the colonists, sharing food and conversation. The English, completely oblivious, welcomed them in. It was the ultimate Trojan horse. At a prearranged signal, the warriors seized whatever tools or weapons were at hand, the colonists' own axes, hoes, and knives, and turned on their hosts. The result was a horrific, bloody massacre. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in their homes and in their fields. The attacks were swift, brutal, and utterly unexpected. In a single morning, about 347 colonists were killed, roughly a quarter of the entire English population in Virginia. The attack was a devastating blow. Entire settlements were wiped out. The outlying plantations were abandoned as the terrified survivors fled to the relative safety of Jamestown and other fortified centers. The colony, which had been expanding with such confidence, was suddenly thrown back on its heels, its territory shrinking overnight. The dream of peaceful coexistence was shattered into a million bloody pieces. The element of surprise was Opechancano's greatest weapon. He very nearly succeeded in his goal of breaking the colony. Jamestown itself was spared, but only thanks to a last-minute warning. A young Powhatan boy, who had been converted to Christianity and was living with an English family, was told of the plot by his uncle the night before. Torn between loyalty to his people and affection for his adoptive family, the boy chose to warn his English host, Richard Pace. Pace, in a desperate race against time, rode across the James River in the middle of the night to alert the governor at Jamestown. The warning came just in time for the central settlement to arm itself and bar its gates. Without this single act of betrayal, Jamestown itself might have fallen, and the entire history of the colony would have ended right there. The psychological impact of the massacre on the English was even more profound than the physical losses. The attack was seen not just as an act of war, but as an act of profound, devilish treachery. The fact that the attackers had been welcomed into their homes, had shared their food, and had then slaughtered them, created a deep and lasting paranoia and hatred. Any lingering English sentiment in favor of civilizing or assimilating the natives was extinguished overnight. The Powhatan were now seen as irredeemable, demonic savages, incapable of trust and worthy only of extermination. The English response was one of total and vengeful war. They abandoned any pretense of diplomacy or restraint. The official policy became one of perpetual enmity. The governor declared that the ultimate goal was the complete expulsion or annihilation of the native population. The war that followed was one of exceptional brutality, even by the standards of the time. The English engaged in seasonal campaigns of destruction, timed to inflict maximum damage on the Powhatan food supply. They would attack in the spring to destroy newly planted crops, in the summer to burn the growing corn before it could be harvested, and in the autumn to destroy their food stores before winter. They used tactics of deception, luring warriors to peace talks only to ambush and poison them. It was a war of extermination, a slow, grinding genocide. The survivors of the starving time, if any still remained, had now witnessed the full spectrum of human misery. They had seen death by disease, death by starvation, death by cannibalism, and now, death by massacre and total war. They had seen their colony shrink to 60 souls and then boom into a sprawling agricultural enterprise. They had seen peace and they had seen war. They were living through the violent, chaotic birth of a new society, a process that was constantly teetering on the brink of annihilation. The massacre of that winter morning was a turning point. It hardened the colonists' hearts, justified a policy of ethnic cleansing in their minds, and set the tone for centuries of brutal conflict between European settlers and Native Americans across the continent. It was a stark reminder that survival in this new world was not guaranteed, and that the cost of building their paradise would be paid in rivers of blood, both their own and others. The aftermath of the attack plunged the colony into another period of hardship, often called the Second Starving Time, as food supplies ran low and the outlying farms were lost. The ghosts of that first, terrible winter were never far away. The period following the Great Massacre was one of grim consolidation and vengeful warfare. The English colony, shocked and bloodied, retreated into a defensive crouch. The sprawling, optimistic expansion of the tobacco boom was over. Once again, life was confined to a few fortified settlements, with Jamestown as the heavily guarded heart. The colonists now lived in a state of constant fear and readiness. The idyllic image of the peaceful plantation was replaced by the reality of the armed blockhouse. Every man was a soldier, every trip to the fields a potential skirmish. This new reality had a devastating impact on the colony's economy and food supply. With so many farmers dead and so many fields abandoned, tobacco production plummeted. More critically, corn production also collapsed. The colonists were too busy fighting and defending themselves to properly cultivate their crops. The war also cut them off from trade with other native groups who might have supplied them with food. As a result, the colony once again faced a severe food shortage. It wasn't as absolute or as sudden as the original starving time, but it was a period of intense hunger and hardship, exacerbated by disease that always flared up in times of malnutrition and crowded living conditions. This second starving time was a bitter echo of the first. The survivors were once again haunted by the specter of famine. The irony was savage. They were now starving not because of their incompetence, but because of a war they had provoked through their own success and expansion. The English response to the massacre was not just military, it was also ideological. Back in England, the news of the attack was a public relations disaster for the Virginia Company. Their narrative of a successful, peaceful colony bringing civilization to the savages was literally blown apart. To salvage their reputation and justify the immense cost of the war, they launched a massive propaganda campaign. They portrayed the Powhatan not as a people defending their homeland, but as treacherous, demonic instruments of Satan. They argued that the massacre was a divine providence, a sign from God that released the English from any moral obligation to respect native claims to the land. The land of the savages was now forfeit, a gift from God to his chosen people to be taken by force. This ideology provided a powerful justification for the brutal war of extermination that followed. It transformed the land grab into a holy crusade. The colonists in Virginia readily embraced this narrative. It helped them process their trauma and fuel their rage. It allowed them to see their own acts of brutality not as war crimes, but as righteous vengeance, a necessary and divinely sanctioned cleansing of the land. The war itself was a grim, attritional affair. The English, with their superior weaponry, had the advantage in open battle, but the Powhatan were masters of guerrilla warfare, using the dense forests and swamps to their advantage. The English tactics became increasingly ruthless. They learned to fight like their enemy, using stealth, ambush, and deception. A particularly notorious incident involved a group of English captains who arranged a peace treaty with a large group of Powhatan. As a gesture of goodwill, they offered a toast with poisoned wine, and then slaughtered the incapacitated warriors. This act of treachery was celebrated in Jamestown as a great victory. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, a long, bloody stalemate that bled both sides white. The Powhatan Confederacy, though resilient, was gradually worn down by the constant destruction of their food supplies and the relentless attrition of a long war. Their population declined, their villages were destroyed, and their power was broken. Opechancanough, the architect of the Great Attack, was eventually captured. An old, frail man by this point, he was taken to Jamestown in chains. While in prison, he was shot in the back and killed by one of his English guards, an ignoble end for a leader who had come so close to destroying the colony. His death marked the effective end of the Powhatan Confederacy as a major political and military force. They were forced to sign a treaty that made them subjects of the King of England and confined them to small reservations. For the English, the end of the war meant security. They could finally expand without the constant threat of attack. The tobacco economy could resume its explosive growth. The colony was now, finally, on a secure footing. But the cost was immense. The war had bankrupted the Virginia Company. So much money had been spent, and so many colonists had died, that the King of England revoked the company's charter and made Virginia a royal colony, directly under his control. The private enterprise was over, the imperial project had begun. The survivors of this entire tumultuous period, from the first landing to the end of the Powhatan Wars, were a new breed of people. They were hardened, pragmatic, and ruthless. They had endured famine, disease, massacre, and war. They had seen the absolute worst of nature and of human nature. They had shed the naive optimism of the first arrivals and adopted a grim, survivalist mentality. They had built their new world not on a foundation of golden dreams, but on tobacco, violence, and the dispossession of the land's original inhabitants. The memory of the starving time, with its unspeakable acts, was now just one chapter in a long and brutal origin story. It was a foundational trauma, a reminder of how quickly civilization could collapse, and a dark justification for the hardness required to prevent it from ever happening again. The ghosts of Jamestown were not just the starved and the cannibalized, they were also the massacred and the dispossessed, a silent chorus witnessing the birth of an empire. Looking back from the vantage point of a newly secured royal colony, the journey of Jamestown seems less like a linear progression and more like a series of violent, convulsive fits. The colony had lurched from one crisis to another, each one threatening to be its last. The starving time stands out as the most visceral and inwardly focused of these crises, a moment when the colony turned in on itself and literally consumed its own people. It was a self-inflicted wound born of catastrophic planning and a fundamental misunderstanding of the environment. The subsequent crises, the massacre and the long war, were outwardly focused, a violent clash between two cultures competing for the same space. Yet, they are all deeply connected. The desperation of the starving time and the memory of it informed the brutal pragmatism that followed. A society that has experienced the absolute bottom is less likely to be squeamish about the methods it uses to claw its way back to the top. The laws divine, moral and martial imposed after the starving time, with their draconian discipline, were a direct reaction to the chaos and indolence that had led to the famine. They were an attempt to impose an iron order on human nature, which the leaders had seen collapse into its most primal state. This new, hardened mindset was then unleashed upon the Powhatan. The colonists who had survived the famine by any means necessary were psychologically prepared to wage a war by any means necessary. The line between boiling a shoe for sustenance and poisoning an enemy at a peace talk is perhaps not as long as one might think. Both are acts of desperate, ruthless survivalism, a belief that the ends justify any means. The legacy of Jane, the 14-year-old girl cannibalized during the famine, is a powerful symbol of this. Her fate represents the ultimate failure of the initial colonial model, the get-rich-quick scheme run by gentlemen. She is the human cost of that hubris. Her desecrated remains are a testament to what happens when a society's support systems, food, leadership, social cohesion, completely disintegrate. The colony had to hit that absolute nadir before it could be rebuilt on a different foundation. The new foundation was tobacco. But tobacco itself was a demanding master. It required land, which meant conflict, and it required labor, which would eventually lead to the horrors of chattel slavery. The system that made Virginia wealthy was a system that perpetuated violence and exploitation. The starving time, in a strange way, can be seen as the fiery crucible in which the character of the Virginia colony was forged. It burned away the dross of unrealistic expectations and left behind a core of hardened, pragmatic, and often brutal survivors. These were the people who would build the plantations, fight the wars, and establish the social and political structures that would define the American South for centuries. The story of Jamestown is often simplified into a heroic tale of pioneers overcoming hardship, with Pocahontas as a romantic footnote. The reality is far darker and more complex. It's a story of corporate greed, staggering incompetence, cultural collision, and extreme human suffering. It's a story about what people are willing to do to each other, and to themselves, when stripped of the veneer of civilization. The starving time is the most potent illustration of this. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the line between a civilized human being and a desperate animal is perilously thin. The colonists who arrived in Virginia were not monsters. They were ordinary people, farmers, laborers, soldiers, and aristocrats, products of their time and culture. They carried with them all the assumptions, prejudices, and blind spots of 17th century England. They were thrown into an extreme situation for which they were utterly unprepared, and they responded in ways that were both horrific and, in a grim sense, logical. When there is nothing left to eat, the definition of food begins to expand. The story serves as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that complex systems, like a colony or even a modern society, are fragile. They depend on a constant, reliable supply of basic necessities, on functional leadership, and on a shared sense of trust and purpose. When those things break down, the descent into chaos can be terrifyingly swift. The men and women huddled in the freezing, stinking huts of Jamestown, chewing on boiled leather and eyeing their dead neighbors, were not a different species from us. They were us, without the safety net. Their story is a journey into the heart of darkness, not in some distant, savage land, but within the walls of their own fort, and within the confines of their own starving bodies. It's a testament to the enduring, and sometimes terrifying, power of the human will to survive, a will that can push people to cross any line and commit any act, even the unthinkable. The colony did more than just survive, it eventually thrived, becoming the largest and most populous of the English colonies in America. But its success was built upon the ashes of its early failures and the bones of those who did not make it. The ghost of the starving time would forever be a part of its DNA. Let's take a moment to consider the sheer sensory experience of the starving time, to move beyond the historical facts and immerse ourselves in the physical reality of that winter. The primary sensation, overwhelming all others, was of course hunger. But this wasn't the casual hunger one feels before a meal. It was a geological force, a slow, grinding pressure that reshaped the body and mind. It would have started as a familiar pang, an emptiness that demanded to be filled. But as days turned into weeks with no relief, that pang would have transformed into a dull, constant ache, a fire in the pit of the stomach that never went out. This ache would have been the first thing they felt upon waking and the last thing they felt as they slipped into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep. The world would have narrowed to a single focus: food. Every thought, every conversation, Every action would be dictated by this one, all-consuming need. The sight of a bird in the sky wouldn't be a moment of natural beauty, but a fleeting, impossible fantasy of a meal. The memory of food would be a form of torture. They would have tormented themselves with vivid recollections of feasts in England, the taste of roast beef, the smell of baking bread, the simple, unbelievable luxury of a ripe apple. These memories would be more real, more vivid than their current reality, making the waking world a pale and miserable shadow. Then there was the cold. This wasn't the crisp, invigorating cold of a winter walk. It was a damp, seeping cold that got into the bones and stayed there. Their clothing, thin and worn, offered little protection. Their huts, hastily built from wattle and daub, were drafty and poorly insulated. The wind would have whistled through the countless cracks, a constant, mournful sound. Firewood was scarce, jealously hoarded. The small fires they could manage would provide a small circle of warmth, but a few feet away, the air would be icy. They would have spent their days huddled together, listless, trying to conserve every scrap of body heat. The cold would have made the hunger worse, as the body burned its last, meager reserves just to stay alive. The world would have been unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of a busy settlement, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the chopping of wood, the boisterous talk and laughter of men, would have been replaced by a profound and eerie silence. The only sounds would be the wind, the hacking coughs of the sick, and perhaps the low, continuous moans of those in the final stages of starvation. This silence would have been more terrifying than any noise, a testament to the utter collapse of energy and hope. The smells would have been overpowering. The fort, with no sanitation, would have reeked of human waste and sickness. The brackish water from the river would have had its own foul, stagnant odor. Added to this would be the smell of decay from the unburied dead, and the strange, acrid stench of desperate cooking, the foul aroma of boiling leather, of scorched rat fur, of things that were never meant to be food. The very air they breathed would have been a constant reminder of their degradation. Their sense of taste would have been warped. After weeks of eating nothing or eating foul-tasting substitutes, the memory of good food would have faded. Their world would be a palette of bitterness and rot. The slimy, gelatinous texture of boiled shoe leather. The gritty, earthy taste of a grub-infested root. The sharp, salty tang of brackish water that made them sick even as it slaked their thirst. And then, the taste of human flesh. What would that have been like, not just physically, but psychologically? It would have been the ultimate transgression, an act that would forever separate them from their former selves. Every bite would have been an admission of utter defeat, a confirmation that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. This sensory assault would have had a profound effect on their minds. Malnutrition causes cognitive impairment. Their thoughts would have been slow and foggy. Paranoia would have been rampant. In the crushing silence and semi-darkness of the huts, the mind plays tricks. Every shadow could be a threat. Every whisper could be a plot. The social bonds that hold a community together would have dissolved under this pressure, replaced by a primal, animalistic suspicion. Each man was an island, locked in his own private hell of hunger, cold, and fear. To survive this was not just to survive a lack of food. It was to survive a total assault on the senses and the psyche. It was to endure a state where every sight, sound, smell, taste, and feeling was a reminder of their horrifying predicament. The 60 who lived through it were not just lucky, they were individuals who, through some combination of physical resilience and mental fortitude, managed to withstand a complete breakdown of their world. They emerged on the other side as different people, forever marked by the memory of the cold, the silence, and the terrible, unspeakable tastes of that long, dark winter. The story of the starving time is fundamentally a story about class. The Virginia Company's initial expedition was a microcosm of English society, with all its rigid hierarchies and class-based assumptions, transplanted into a wilderness that had no respect for any of it. The presence of so many gentlemen on the first ships was the venture's original sin. These were men defined by what they did not do. They did not farm, they did not build, they did not hunt for their own food. Their social status was derived from their freedom from manual labor. They came to Virginia under the assumption that this social order would continue. They expected to oversee the work, not to do it. They were there to find gold and to manage the enterprise, while the lower-class commoners were expected to perform the actual, physical tasks of survival. This fundamental division was a recipe for disaster. In a survival situation, a blacksmith or a carpenter is infinitely more valuable than a nobleman's fourth son who knows how to fence and compose a sonnet. But the gentlemen, by virtue of their status, held the power. They controlled the council, they made the decisions, and for a long time, they refused to adapt to their new reality. They spent precious time and energy on pursuits that were aligned with their class identity, prospecting for gold, exploring for a route to the Pacific, while neglecting the mundane, but essential, tasks of planting corn and building proper shelters. They were trying to run a fantasy expedition in the middle of a real-world survival crisis. John Smith's brief and tyrannical rule was a direct assault on this class structure. His famous edict, "He that will not work, shall not eat," was a revolution in miniature. It upended the natural order of their world. It told the gentlemen that in this new world, their soft hands and fancy titles were worthless. A man's value was determined not by his birth, but by his contribution to the group's survival. This was, of course, deeply offensive to them, and they celebrated his departure. But Smith's rule had proven a vital point. The old class system was not just unhelpful in Virginia, it was actively suicidal. Once Smith was gone, the old habits and hierarchies likely reasserted themselves, contributing to the rapid decline into the starving time. The gentlemen, once again in charge, were simply not equipped, temperamentally or practically, to lead the colony through a crisis. Their leadership skills were for a world of courtly intrigue and land management, not for rationing food and fighting a guerrilla war. The famine, however, was a brutal and effective leveler of class distinctions. As George Percy, himself an aristocrat, lamented, hunger made no distinction between the gentleman and the common sort. A starving nobleman is just as desperate, just as weak, and ultimately, just as willing to do the unthinkable as a starving peasant. The starving time stripped them of their fine clothes, their titles, and their pride. It reduced them all to the same primal state. A man who is boiling his own shoes for dinner has lost any claim to social superiority. In this sense, the famine was a horrifyingly democratic event. However, it's also likely that the lower classes suffered first and most acutely. The gentlemen, being in charge, would have controlled access to the dwindling food stores for as long as possible. The initial deaths from starvation and disease were probably concentrated among the laborers and servants, those with the least power and the fewest personal resources. The cannibalism itself may have had a class dimension. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's plausible that the bodies of the poor and powerless were the first to be consumed. The story of Jane is instructive here. She was a young girl, likely a maidservant, someone with low status in the colony. Her youth and her gender would have made her vulnerable. Her body being discarded in a common trash pit, alongside animal bones, suggests she was seen as disposable, her humanity secondary to her value as a source of calories. After the starving time, with the imposition of the laws divine, moral and martial, a new kind of class system emerged. It was not based on birth, but on military rank. The colony was now an army, with a strict chain of command. The governor was the general, his officers were the captains, and the average colonist was a private soldier. Your life was dictated by your rank. This new system was more effective for survival, but it was just as rigid and oppressive as the one it replaced. The dream of the New World as a place of opportunity and social mobility was, for a time, dead. You were what the company told you were. The eventual rise of the tobacco-based plantation economy would create a new class structure, a landed gentry of wealthy planters who stood atop a pyramid supported by indentured servants and, eventually, enslaved Africans. This new aristocracy was not based on ancient titles, but on wealth generated from the land and from the exploitation of labor. In a way, the gentlemen had won in the end. They had recreated a hierarchical society in their own image, one where they did not have to perform manual labor. But it was a society forged in the fires of near annihilation, and its foundations were far more brutal and precarious than the one they had left behind. The starving time was the terrifying interlude when all class distinctions were rendered meaningless by the great equalizer of hunger, a brief, horrifying glimpse of a world without order, before a new, and in many ways more ruthless, order was imposed. The role of the Powhatan Confederacy in the story of the starving time is crucial and complex. They were not simply a hostile backdrop but active agents who shaped the colony's fate. To the English, who arrived with a profound sense of cultural and technological superiority, the native inhabitants of Virginia were a puzzle. They were at once seen as savages, naked, godless, and primitive, and as a resource to be exploited. The English wanted their land, they wanted their knowledge of the local environment, and most immediately, they wanted their food. This created a deeply contradictory and unstable relationship from the outset. The colonists were utterly dependent on the very people they disdained. The Powhatan, for their part, were a powerful and sophisticated political entity. Chief Powhatan, Wahunsenkaw, ruled over a confederacy of some 30 tribes, a territory that stretched over a vast area. He was a shrewd and experienced leader. He saw the English not as gods, but as another tribe, a strange and unpredictable one, but a tribe nonetheless. His initial strategy seems to have been one of cautious engagement and containment. He was willing to trade with the English, especially for their copper and metal tools, which he valued. The trade for corn was a lifeline for the Jamestown colonists in their first years. Without the Powhatan's agricultural surplus, the colony would have collapsed almost immediately. However, this trade was always tense. The English, under leaders like John Smith, often resorted to threats and intimidation to get what they wanted. They were not polite customers. This gangster-style diplomacy created resentment and eroded trust. Smith's approach, while it procured food in the short term, poisoned the well for the future. The Powhatan were not passive victims. They were observing the English, learning their weaknesses. They saw that the colonists were terrible farmers, that they died in great numbers from disease, and that they were internally divided. They understood the colonists' desperate need for food, and they realized that this was their most powerful weapon. When John Smith left Virginia, the Powhatan leadership saw an opportunity. They shifted their strategy from cautious trade to a full-blown siege. This was not a siege in the European sense, with walls and catapults. It was a siege of the landscape itself. They used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to cut the colonists off from every source of sustenance. They prevented them from hunting by killing anyone who ventured into the woods. They prevented them from fishing effectively. They slaughtered their foraging livestock. And most importantly, they completely cut off the trade in corn. This decision, to withhold food, was the direct cause of the starving time. It was a deliberate act of war, a strategic choice to let the English wither and die within their own fort. From the Powhatan perspective, this was a logical and perhaps necessary course of action. These strange intruders were proving to be a persistent and disruptive presence. They were demanding, aggressive, and their numbers seemed to be growing with the arrival of new ships. Allowing them to starve seemed like the most efficient way to solve the problem. The effectiveness of the siege demonstrates the Powhatan's power and their deep understanding of their own environment. They turned the colonists' greatest weakness, their ignorance of the land, against them. The bountiful Virginia wilderness, which could have fed them, became a green prison. The Powhatan held the keys, and they chose to lock the door. The story of Pocahontas represents the other side of this relationship, the brief moments of connection and potential for a different path. Her actions, whether bringing food to the fort or her eventual marriage to John Rolfe, created temporary thaws in the conflict. However, these individual relationships were not enough to overcome the fundamental clash of interests between the two societies. The English wanted land, and the Powhatan were not willing to give it up. The Peace of Pocahontas was an anomaly, a brief pause in an inevitable conflict. After the starving time and the arrival of Lord de la Warr, the power dynamic shifted. The English, now better supplied and more militarized, went on the offensive. The war that followed was a brutal reversal of the starving time. The English now systematically used starvation as a weapon against the Powhatan, burning their cornfields and destroying their food stores. They had learned the lesson of the siege, and they applied it with ruthless efficiency. The starving time can thus be seen as a pivotal moment in the relationship between the two peoples. It was the moment the Powhatan came closest to eradicating the English presence. Their failure to do so, due to the timely arrival of de la Warr's fleet, meant that they had lost their best chance. The war that followed was not a war for coexistence, but a war for dominance, a war that the Powhatan, facing a technologically superior and demographically expanding enemy, were destined to lose. The English never forgot the lesson of that winter. The fear of being starved by a hostile native power would shape their policies for decades, driving them to seek not just security, but total subjugation of the native population. The memory of their own desperation fueled their subsequent brutality. Let's dissect the catastrophic failure of leadership that defined the starving time. A colony, especially a remote and precarious one, is like a ship in a storm. Its survival is almost entirely dependent on the skill and judgment of its captain. Jamestown, during that fateful winter, was a rudderless ship, captained by incompetence and steered by despair. The first and most critical failure was that of the Virginia Company itself. The planners in London were a world away, operating on a business model built of fantasy. Their instructions to the colonists were a masterclass in misguided priorities. They emphasized the search for gold, the discovery of a northwest passage, and quick returns for their investors. They woefully underestimated the sheer difficulty of establishing a self-sustaining agricultural community. They sent a contingent of colonists top-heavy with gentlemen and specialists in irrelevant fields, and bottom-heavy with the farmers and laborers who were actually needed. They were, in essence, trying to build a company headquarters before they had even laid the foundation for the factory. This initial strategic failure set the colony up for disaster from day one. On the ground in Virginia, the leadership was a rotating cast of characters, often defined by infighting, jealousy, and a complete lack of relevant experience. The colony was governed by a council, a system designed to prevent any one man from having too much power, but which in practice led to paralysis and factionalism. Men were more concerned with their own status and undermining their rivals than with the collective good. Captain John Smith stands out as the great exception. He was not a good man by modern standards. He was an autocrat, a bully, and a shameless self-promoter. But he was an effective leader for the specific crisis Jamestown faced. He understood the priorities: security, food, and order. He forced people to work, he managed the delicate and dangerous relationship with the Powhatan, and he imposed a sense of purpose on the chaotic settlement. His leadership was a dictatorship, but it was a functional dictatorship. His accidental departure was the single most devastating blow to the colony's chances of survival. It created a power vacuum that was filled by men who were utterly unequal to the task. George Percy, who took over as president, was a nobleman, the younger brother of an earl. He was a well-born gentleman, but he was not a leader of men in a crisis. His own account of the starving time is one of a horrified spectator, not a commander taking decisive action. He chronicles the descent into horror, the eating of animals, then leather, then corpses, with a kind of passive despair. There is no sense in his writing that he was issuing orders, organizing the survivors, or attempting to break the Powhatan siege. He seems to have simply presided over the colony's dissolution, watching as his fellow colonists starved and died around him. The leadership failed to maintain discipline. They failed to ration the remaining food effectively. They failed to organize any credible defense or counteroffensive against the Powhatan siege. They allowed the colony to slide into a state of anarchy, where it was every man for himself. The social contract dissolved, and the fort became a collection of desperate individuals rather than a cohesive community. When Sir Thomas Gates arrived from Bermuda, he found not a struggling colony, but a failed state. His decision to abandon Jamestown was a frank admission of the total collapse of leadership and order. It was the right decision based on the evidence before him. The arrival of Lord De La Warr represented a complete shift in leadership philosophy. De La Warr and his successors were military men. They led not by consensus or counsel, but by decree. The laws divine, moral and martial were the ultimate expression of this new approach. They replaced the chaos of weak leadership with the iron fist of totalitarian control. The colony was saved from extinction, but at the cost of its members' freedom. This stark contrast highlights the central lesson of the starving time. In an extreme crisis, weak, divided, or incompetent leadership is a death sentence. A leader's job is to make the hard decisions, to impose order, to allocate scarce resources, and to maintain hope. The leadership of Jamestown during the winter of the starving time failed on every single one of these counts. They did not lead, they merely watched. Their failure is written in the bones of the nearly 440 people who died on their watch, a chilling testament to the fact that the most dangerous thing in a survival situation is not the environment or the enemy, but the vacuum of command. They were the architects of their own apocalypse. The story of the starving time did not end when the last survivor was rescued. It entered the realm of myth, propaganda, and historical memory, where its meaning was contested and reshaped for centuries. In the immediate aftermath, the accounts of the survivors, particularly George Percy and Captain John Smith, were crucial in shaping the narrative back in England. These accounts were not objective historical documents, They were arguments. Smith, in his writings, used the starving time as proof of his own indispensable leadership. He painted a picture of a functional colony under his command that collapsed into chaos the moment he left. The lesson, for his readers, was clear. The colony needed strong, pragmatic leaders like him, not the inept gentleman who had replaced him. His version of events, while self-serving, was highly influential and cemented his place in history as the savior of early Jamestown. Percy's account, on the other hand, was a more straightforward, if horrifying, chronicle of the disaster. It was less about self-aggrandizement and more about bearing witness to the almost unimaginable suffering. His descriptions of cannibalism were shocking and sensational, and they provided the most vivid and lasting images of the famine. For the Virginia Company, the starving time was a public relations nightmare. It undermined their entire sales pitch of Virginia as a land of abundance and opportunity. They tried to control the narrative, downplaying the extent of the disaster and blaming it on a combination of Powhatan treachery and the laziness of some colonists. When news of the Great Massacre arrived years later, the company and its supporters cleverly used the memory of the starving time. They linked the two events, arguing that the Powhatan had always been deceitful and murderous, first by trying to starve the colony and then by trying to slaughter it. This created a powerful narrative of English victimhood and native savagery, which justified the brutal wars of extermination that followed. As the centuries passed, the story of Jamestown was often sanitized and romanticized in American popular culture. The focus shifted to the more palatable parts of the story, the adventure of the first landing, the heroic figure of John Smith, and the Disney-fied romance of John Rolfe and Pocahontas. The starving time, with its grim realities of disease, famine, and cannibalism, was often glossed over or ignored entirely. It was a messy, uncomfortable, and deeply unflattering chapter in the nation's origin story. It didn't fit neatly into the heroic narrative of brave pioneers forging a new nation in the wilderness. The archaeological rediscovery of Jamestown in the late 20th century, and specifically the discovery of Jane's remains, brought the starving time crashing back into the public consciousness. This was a game changer. The story of cannibalism was no longer just a lurid tale from a few questionable historical texts. It was now a verifiable, scientific fact, written in the cut marks on a young girl's bones. Archaeology gave a voice to the victims. Jane's skeleton provided irrefutable physical evidence that forced historians and the public to confront the full horror of what happened. It stripped away the layers of myth and romanticism and exposed the raw, desperate reality of the colony's early years. It confirmed that the survivors' accounts, however shocking, were not exaggerations. Today, the story of the starving time serves as a crucial corrective to the sanitized version of American history. It reminds us that the founding of the nation was not a clean or heroic process. It was brutal, messy, and fraught with failure. It was built on the suffering and death of thousands, both European and Native American. The story is a powerful lesson in the fragility of civilization. It shows how quickly social norms can break down under extreme pressure and how close to the surface our most primal survival instincts are. It also serves as a case study in the dangers of corporate greed, poor planning, and cultural arrogance. The ghosts of the starving time, the hollow-eyed survivors, the cannibalized dead, the silent witness of Jane, continue to haunt the foundations of American history. They force us to ask uncomfortable questions about the price of survival, the nature of civilization, and the dark compromises that lie at the heart of our collective origin story. Their tale is not one of glory, but of a grim, desperate endurance that would ultimately, against all odds, lay the groundwork for a nation. As we draw the curtains on this particularly grim bedtime story, let's reflect on the ultimate legacy of the famine that made people eat the unthinkable. The Jamestown colony did not just survive, it became the seat of the Commonwealth of Virginia, a cornerstone of the original 13 colonies, and the birthplace of many of the ideals and contradictions that would come to define the United States. The legacy of the starving time is woven, like a dark thread, throughout this entire tapestry. It imbued the Virginia colony with a certain hardness, a pragmatic and often ruthless approach to life and governance that was born from having stared into the abyss. The society that emerged from that crucible was one that valued order, discipline, and property above all else, because its founders had experienced the absolute chaos that ensues when those things are lost. The desperation for a profitable enterprise, a desperation sharpened by the memory of utter failure, led directly to the tobacco economy. And the tobacco economy, with its insatiable need for land and labor, led directly to the two great original sins of American history: the systematic dispossession of Native Americans and the establishment of African slavery. The men who would later draft declarations of liberty and champion the rights of man were the direct inheritors of this system, a society built on a foundation of bondage and exclusion. This is the central paradox of the Jamestown legacy. The same colony that produced figures like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, champions of liberty, was a society whose very existence was predicated on the denial of liberty to others. This contradiction was not an accident. It was baked into the colony's DNA from its earliest, most desperate days. The survivors of the starving time learned a brutal lesson. In the New World, survival was a zero-sum game. For them to thrive, others had to be displaced or exploited. This mindset, forged in the horror of that first decade, echoed down through the centuries. The story of Jamestown is not just about the English. It is also the story of the Powhatan, a powerful and resilient people whose world was irrevocably shattered by the arrival of these strange, starving intruders. Their story is one of resistance, adaptation, and ultimately, tragic loss. The starving time was a turning point for them as well. It was the moment they came closest to winning, to expelling the invaders before they could take root. Their failure to do so, by the slimmest of margins, sealed their fate. And so, as you drift off to sleep, consider this: the world we inhabit today is built on the foundations laid by these desperate, flawed, and suffering people. The comforts and complexities of our modern lives are the distant echoes of their struggles. The story of the starved time is a stark reminder that history is not a clean, heroic epic. It is a messy, bloody, and often horrifying tale of survival against the odds. It is a story of what happens when grand dreams collide with grim reality, and when human beings are pushed to the absolute limit of their endurance. It's a story of incompetence, of resilience, of brutality, and of the enduring, terrifying human capacity to do whatever it takes to see another sunrise. It is, in short, a quintessential piece of dark history. Thank you for joining us in this particularly bleak corner of the past. I do sincerely hope we haven't completely destroyed your ability to sleep tonight. If you find yourself staring at the ceiling, contemplating the taste of boiled leather, well, my apologies. Or perhaps, you're welcome. It all depends on your perspective, doesn't it? If you manage to survive this tale, please consider giving that like button a gentle nudge and subscribing to The Dark History for more soothing tales of historical misery. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is in your little pocket of the night. It's always a comfort to know we're not alone in the dark. Until next time, try to have pleasant dreams. And remember, no matter how bad your day was, At least you probably didn't have to eat your neighbor. Good night.